Good day, everyone. Today we will discuss Andresito Acuna's Philosophical Analysis Unit 4, Modules 5 to 7. Let's start with Module 5, Fallacy, Counterfeit Argument. To be a critical thinker is to have complete mastery of detecting fallacies. Starting off with argumentum ad hominem. This fallacy challenges the person's character rather than the validity of his argument. It is when person B rejects an argument by pointing out a character flaw of the person who offered the argument, which is person A. For example, we should ignore what John said about hard work. He doesn't even have a job. Next is argumentum ad baculum. This argument appeals to physical or moral force. Thus, when we threaten those who disagree with us instead of debating the subject at hand, we fall prey to this fallacy. For example, I am your teacher. If you do not follow what I say, I will fail you. Next is argumentum ad misericordiam. It appeals to pity and disregards the point in question. Example: please give me a higher score, teacher. If I fail, I will be grounded. Argumentum ignorantiam. When someone claims that something must be true because it hasn't been proven to be untrue, or that something must be false because it hasn't been proven to be true. Example: you are intelligent enough to know that nobody has succeeded in disproving the existence of miracles. Therefore, miracles exists. Argumentum ad populum. This fallacy appeals to popularity and traditional institutions. It asserts that a claim is true because most people think it is. We are Catholics. We value human life more than any material things in the world. By proposing the use of euthanasia, are you suggesting we abandon this time honored traditional value? Argumentum ad verecundiam. This fallacy appeals to authority. An argument becomes fallacious when it is the wrong authority. According to well known actor Tom Cruise, Sevi is the greatest philosopher. As a wonderful person whose word should not be questioned, I believe him. Strawman fallacy. This fallacy occurs when someone purposefully misrepresents an argument in order to weaken it. They create a strawman and present it as the actual argument. Person A says, we should eat less beef because domestication requires a lot of effort. Person B says, you want us to be vegetarian. Red herring fallacy occurs when relevant information is provided with irrelevant material to detract attention, causing the relevant information to be neglected. An example of this is, I can't buy you your favorite food, but I can play with you. False analogy fallacy implies that two things that are similar in one way leads to the false assumption that they must also be similar in another way. Slippery slope fallacy. When something is permitted to occur, it naturally follows that one will permit it to occur in other instances. It asserts that the consequence of the action will set off a chain of unwanted events. Fallacy of complex question has the form of a question with a false presumption. The question assumes the truth of a hidden conclusion. The opponent is rendered speechless by a question that is unanswerable, not because the opponent has been caught in a contradiction, but rather because the question is misdirected. Petisio principii. The argument must include evidence to support its assertion. The argument's premise is just a restatement of the conclusion. Fallacy of false dilemma. Despite having several options or sides, it only offers two. The argument is convincing since its form is valid. However, the dilemma being forced is false. Non sequitur, which in Latin reads, it does not follow. This fallacy is made when a statement or conclusion does not flow logically from the premise set. Thus, the conclusion's claim is not supported by the premises. Moving on to Module 6, Theory of Appraisal for Simple Arguments. The three types of argument are empirical, analytic, and evaluative. Let's start off with empirical argument. To expose an argument's weaknesses and prove that it is grounded on a fallacy, you must criticize it. To revise, modify, and improve the argument during evaluation, the argument's strengths and weaknesses must be stated. One must master the ability to identify the strength of an argument whether criticizing or evaluating. An empirical argument bases its conclusion on a probability estimate and uses empirical generalization as its fundamental premise. Although this kind of argument is one of the simplest to construct and relatively prevalent, it does not always have a nice structure. In writing an empirical argument, it begins with an empirical generalization or generalization with percentage estimate as the main premise. For example, the generalization is most students from Block B reviews for their exam. The premise is Sophie and Maury are from Block B. Conclusion. Therefore, most likely than not, Sophie and Maury reviews for their exam. Another example is there are more than 6,000 UP freshmen in Diliman in 1998, and only 10 freshmen are atheists. Earl is a UP freshman. Therefore, more likely than not, Earl is not an atheist. An empirical argument need not follow this orderly format of main premises, one minor premise, and a conclusion. Given that you've found a solid generalization, there are other patterns you can adopt when constructing your own argument to extend your generalization to cases you have not observed. An example of an argument that emulates the neat structure before, without the qualifier main premise, minor premise, and conclusion. Since Earl is a UP freshman, and since there are more than 6,000 UP freshmen in Diliman in 1998, but only 10 freshmen are atheists, therefore, more likely than not, Earl is not an atheist. In a well composed argument, a critical thinker must utilize the conclusion indicator to emphasize the conclusion and the premise indicator to mark the premises. The conclusion indicators are therefore, hence, accordingly, then, so, implies, consequently, thus, and it follows. The premise indicators are because, since, for, in view of the fact, inasmuch as, and as shown by. By memorizing these indicators, it will help develop your skill in identifying the premise and conclusion of an argument, and develop your skill in composing arguments. Since the premises and conclusion of the simple empirical arguments are empirical statements that can be true, untrue, or probable, the strength of the arguments is a matter of degree. The main premises above were based on empirical generalizations, which are only probability estimates and not statistical. Note that you can use an honest statistical generalization as your main premise. The main premise's reliability determines how strong an argument will be, and you must estimate the level of confidence you can place in the generalization using the three tests. If all three tests are passed, we put a high level of confidence in the support that the main premise provides for the argument's conclusion. Inductive argument. If we remember from Module 3, inductive goes from specific to general. Examples of inductive arguments as another type of empirical argument is Maria is a UP freshman, batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. Anna is also a UP freshman, batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. Pepe is also a UP freshman, batch 1998 and comes from a poor family. All UP freshmen batch 1998 that I am acquainted with come from poor families, and there is no conflicting case. Therefore, most UP freshmen batch 1998 come from poor families. A majority claim needs proof that at least 50% plus 1 of the UP freshman class of 1998 must come from poor families. But chances are you don't have any such records. Thus, there isn't much support for the conclusion made above. If you do have data and the generalization most is confirmed, your argument is strong and nearly impervious to criticism. If the premises supported the contrary of the conclusion, that is, the majority of UP freshmen from the 1998 batch did not come from poor families. Since we are unsure of the percentage of people who came from wealthy or poor families, there is still a lack of support. This implies that we are unsure of the sample's representation of the entire population. Consider changing your conclusion from most to many, due to the fact that a many claim requires significantly less evidence than a most claim does. If your evidence can only substantiate a many claim, you shouldn't make a most claim. Most UP freshmen batch 1998 come from poor families. Isabel is a UP freshman batch 1998 currently enrolled in Philo 1. Therefore, more likely than not, Isabel comes from a poor family. Now, does the generalization modes include Isabel? To strengthen the argument, add a new evidence, which is discovering 80% of Philo 1 students currently enrolled in batch 1998 come from poor families, which leads us to most UP freshmen batch 1998 come from poor families. Isabel is a UP freshman batch 1998 currently enrolled in Philo 1. 80% of Philo 1 students batch 1998 come from poor families. Therefore, more likely than not, Isabel comes from a poor family. The support for the conclusion was increased by the inclusion of the third premise, a statistical generalization. Isabel might be among the 20% of people who are wealthy, which leaves open the chance that the conclusion is still untrue. The best way to refute an empirical claim is to claim that it does not meet the three tests for a good generalization, or that the needed evidence for the level of generalization claimed has not been satisfied. Analytic argument has the same simple structure as empirical argument, though the major premise is an analytical statement which consists of definitions or well-formed formula of some formal systems. Analytical statements are either true or false only. Example of analytical statements. A father is a male parent. One is a male parent. Therefore, one is a father. Next is humans are bipedal. Joaquin is human. Therefore, Joaquin is bipedal. If the definition is analytically true, as well as the minor premise, then the premises support the conclusion's validity. Only in this form of argument are there no degrees of strength allowed. Either the analytical reasoning is excellent or it is awful. The best way to refute an analytical argument in this case is to show that the definition is arguable or show that the premise is not an instance of the definition. Evaluative argument. These are arguments with the conclusion that claims something is moral or immoral. The main premise is a maxim, a moral rule. The appeal is on the strength of public acceptance or the strength of intersubjective consensus of the intended audience. Public acceptance is difficult to estimate, yet if the main premise is a maxim, then you have a good assurance that the rule is an accepted generalization of the intersubjective consensus of people. Evaluative argument is the most neglected type of argument, however, it is the most commonly composed. We might not be aware of it, but we have composed evaluative arguments when we justify an act as good or bad. Deontological argument, the ability to judge how reasons justify a claim as good, right, or correct. Never push an innocent person. Pedro is accused of a crime, but he is innocent. Therefore, Pedro should not be pushed. Whether or not the moral rule, never push an innocent person, is widely accepted by the general public determines the strength of this argument. Accepting the premise's correctness will force you to accept the conclusion's correctness as well if there is a significant intersubjective consensus. Audience acceptance is essential in evaluative arguments rather than truth conditions. Never break a promise. June promised to come to the party at 9 p.m. Therefore, June should come at 9 p.m. The strength of this argument is defeated by an exception to the rule. Never break a promise in our culture is sometimes defeated without any serious consequences. Thus, the saying, promises are made to be broken, to justify breaking a promise. Example of arguments with concealed moral rule. Pedro and June are both efficient Philo 1 teachers. Pedro and June both finished their MA at the same time. Pedro was promoted and was given tenure. Therefore, June ought to be promoted and be given tenure too. Whether the concealed principle of fairness, same merit, same qualification can pass the audience acceptability test determines the strength of the argument. Another example is Maria and Anna were both caught cheating in their Philo 1 exam. Maria received a grade of 5. Therefore, Anna should receive a grade of 5 too. The moral principle of same offense, same punishment serves as the concealed premise. The deontological argument pattern refers to the evaluative argument's appeal to the nature of the act itself. Next is the teleological argument. It appeals to the consequences of the acts. An act is right if it produces some desired consequences. The rightness of an act depends largely on the consequences of the act. All actions in accordance with God's will are good. The Ten Commandments are in accordance with God's will. Thus, you ought to obey the Ten Commandments. This argument gave a precise definition of the word good. Therefore, every action that furthers God's will is morally correct, whereas any action that impedes God's will is wrong. If you agree with the premises, you must also agree that the conclusion is correct. While the teleological argument cannot determine whether an evaluative claim is correct without taking its consequences into account, the deontological argument makes the act's consequences irrelevant. Lastly, Module 7, Composing Complex Arguments. The principles and skills needed for you to compose an argument is numerous but not difficult when the steps are properly sequenced. Each step will facilitate the task of composing an argument, criticizing its strength and composing a counter argument. First step, examine the statement of the conclusion. Briefly state your conclusion. Sorting out the types of concepts utilized in the conclusion will make it easier for you to respond to the questions that follow because it will set the tone for the rest of the template's components. If you classify incorrectly, your conclusion's knowledge claim will also be incorrectly classified. Use the analytic definition technique to define the important concepts in your conclusion to establish a common frame of reference. Watch out for words that could be seen as being ambiguous. Can the definitions of the concepts be agreed upon? Or is the term's definition itself skewed and debatable? The second step, analysis of the claim of the conclusion. Class the result into analytical, empirical, or evaluative knowledge claims. A mistake in classifying the claim of your conclusion, a mistake in identifying the necessary evidence to support the claim of your conclusion. What is the conclusion trying to prove? What is the required proof in order to justify the claim of the conclusion? This is the most critical step. Thus, if you cannot answer the question, you cannot compose the argument. Let's break down the question in simple steps. If the conclusion is an empirical generalization, a rising degree of generalization starting with some, many, most, almost, all. To prove its level, you can refer to the evidence needed. If the conclusion makes an evaluative claim, we can appeal to the level of public support for the claim as proof. If the conclusion is a legal or policy proposal, you may point to the positive outcomes if the recommendation is implemented, or you can avoid outcomes if the recommendation is not implemented. The claim is provable if it falls within the scope of what's known and what's knowable. If the claim cannot be known, it cannot be proven, and you should discontinue using the template. If provable, assess the validity of the evidence. The third step, compose the argument. Provide at least 3, but no more than 5 premises that would most strongly support the premise of your conclusion. The fourth step, criticize the argument. Scrutinize the conclusion. Reread the conclusion and review the language used. Review the conclusion's assertion. Confront the conclusion and disprove it. Produce as many rebuttal examples as possible if the claim is most. If the claim is all, reject the conclusion by providing a counterexample. Challenge the conclusion if it makes an evaluative claim by requesting the proof needed for it to be widely accepted. Reject the argument as false if no supporting evidence was provided in the premises. Confront the evaluative conclusion and demonstrate why destroying the evaluative claim is in violation of a certain moral standard of public acceptance. If the conclusion offers a legal or policy proposal, contest the probability estimate of the predicted beneficial and harmful effects. Scrutinize the premise set. Check if there are duplications in the premise set. If yes, merge the redundant premises. Classify the assortment of your premises into types of knowledge claims. Are there inconsistent or contradictory premises? Make a tentative estimate of the strength of the argument by ranking the strength of the support from each premise. Determine if the premises are all necessary to prove the conclusion. Demonstrate that the premise set is not sufficient to establish the claim of the conclusion by claiming that the premise set is inadequate to prove what is wanted. Determine if there is no important premise missing the set. Are the evaluative premises supported by public approval? Are there empirical generalizations in the premises? Contest them by demanding the required evidence for each level of generalization. Criticize the estimate of likelihood of the occurrence of both the beneficial and aversive consequences in a legal or policy proposal. Demonstrate that the premises is inadequate since it did not offer the best reason to support the conclusion. When the premise set failed to justify the claim of the conclusion, challenge the premises one by one, starting with the premise that offered the strongest support. The fifth step: compose the counter argument. Defend the opposite of your original conclusion. Provide at least three, but no more than five premises that would support the claim of the opposite conclusion. Lastly, the sixth step: evaluate both arguments. As a critical thinker, state which of your arguments is stronger, the original or the counter argument. Evaluate the strength of your original argument and counter argument. And that is all for Unit 4, Modules 5 to 7.